So in today's lesson, we're going to be discussing light and photosynthetic pigments. So you'll know from previous lessons that chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B are two very significant photosynthetic pigments, but there are more than just the two that were mentioned previously. There are others, and so we're going to bring that into our conversation today. So first, just a few quick background reminders. Light, when we talk about light, I'm going to be talking about the visible portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. And in grade 10, we talked about the electromagnetic spectrum in great detail. You remember that we, talked about gamma, X-ray, and so on and so forth. And we also mentioned that to remind you that, basically there's an inverse relationship between wavelength and frequency and wavelengths and energy. So for instance, I can see over here in my radio wave section that the wavelength is quite long for radio waves as opposed to gamma rays, which are where the wavelength is quite short. However, having said that, we know that gamma rays are quite powerful, right? They can cause genetic mutation, whereas radio waves typically don't do that. And so we can say that the energy of a gamma ray is much higher. Whereas the radio waves energy is much lower and so less penetrating. So again, inverse relationship: longer wavelength equals lower energy, shorter wavelength equals higher energy. Now, I should mention before we move on that only about 5% of the sun's energy is actually getting utilized in photosynthesis to produce chemical potential energy, and by that we mean, stored in molecules of glucose. So it's not super efficient to begin with. So I want to talk to you today about ways that the process is made as efficient as it can be, given this really low rate of energy transfer. So here are a few of the points that I mentioned just a couple seconds ago. First of all, we know that wavelength is inversely proportional to energy, so shorter wavelength equals higher energy. Gamma rays might be the shortest, but radio waves are the longest. However, our gamma rays are going to be the highest energy, and our radio waves are going to have low energy. Pardon me. You'll remember also from chemistry that we will often refer to particles of light or packets of light as photons, so that may come up in part of our conversation today. Now, we're going to bring color into this conversation because, of course, different photosynthetic pigments will each carry their own color. And we know that leaves are green, not so much because they absorb green wavelengths of light, but because they reflect them. So I want to remind you that what is visible to us is this, in the visible spectrum, are wavelengths that go from about a little bit below 400 nanometers all the way up to 7 nanometers. And when we say nanometers, we're talking about wavelengths of light. So within the visible spectrum, the individual colors that we perceive all have different wavelengths, different individual wavelengths themselves, so we can really break that down. And so that's going to have an impact on photosynthesis because, of course, there may be some wavelengths within the visible spectrum that the plant is able to utilize, that our photosystems are going to be able to utilize more efficiently than others. So this brings me to the next part of our conversation, where we're going to look at, which photosynthetic pigments are going to function best at which particular wavelengths of light. So I want to distinguish between photosynthetic and accessory pigments. So when I think of the word accessory, I think of something that is like an add-on. And that's essentially what an accessory pigment is. It's an add-on pigment that also helps to support our basic fundamental photosynthetic pigments. So what we have here are two different graphs And they're essentially giving us very similar information, though it is distinct information. So over here on the left, you'll notice that on my x-axis, I'm looking at wavelengths of light in nanometers. And on my y-axis, I have the amount of light absorbed. And so what's been graphed here is just the different pigments that are involved in photosynthesis and where they absorb light the best. So for instance, I'm going to focus on chlorophyll A for a second here. And I can see that chlorophyll A's absorption spectrum, and that's what this graph on the left is, it's an absorption spectrum. It seems that chlorophyll A absorbs light best at sort of these earlier wavelengths between 400 and maybe 450. And then it also seems to absorb best at longer wavelengths. So that is where it's going to make the best use out of light's energy. It's going to take the wavelengths of light that are sort of the low end and the high end of the visible spectrum, but it can't really do much with all of those wavelengths that are in between. So that's a problem because we want to make the most out of the light energy that's available to the plant. So that's where our accessory pigments are going to come in. So we have chlorophyll B here, which has a slightly shifted absorption spectrum relative to chlorophyll A. So whereas chlorophyll A can't do anything with these wavelengths of, I want to say 450 to 500, chlorophyll B can grab and make use of some of those wavelengths within the visible spectrum. And same with carotenoids. And I've only shown you three of the possible three of the possible photosynthetic pigments, but many, many more exist that will start to fill in the possible absorption spectrum for visible light. Right? So what is the point of our accessory pigments? To basically, take in more light than would otherwise be possible were we only to have maybe one photosynthetic pigment alone. And so over here on the right, what I have is what's called an action spectrum. I'm going to just write a little bit of this down. So on the left, I have what's called an absorption, I think that's right, spectrum. And what I have on the left, what I have on the right over here is what we call an action spectrum. And they give overlapping information, so I'm just going to distinguish for you the difference. So absorption spectrum specifically focuses on our pigments and where they best absorb visible light. The action spectrum shows the wavelengths of light where photosynthesis is basically happening, okay? There's some action happening. So, the graph here is showing that, photosynthesis is optimized sort of in these lower wavelengths, and the higher, there's less action happening sort of in the middle zone. And that should make sense to you because, we know that, when we perceive colors, I'm just going to draw a quick little leaf here. Don't laugh at me, but there's my leaf. We know that the reason that we see green when we look at a leaf, or, shades of green, that is because when the light is hitting it, it is bouncing off and reflecting into our eye. Hello, grade 10 optics. And so that's why we're seeing green. But so the colors that we see are because they're being reflected off of a particular material, right? Whereas, in photosynthesis, we want we want those wavelengths of light to be absorbed in order to be utilized. So it should make sense that, the action spectrum of photosynthesis is going to not be happening in that sort of greeny zone, green-yellow zone, because the plant ends up, reflecting a lot of those wavelengths off. So, in case you would prefer to write some of these details down, we can look at the wavelengths specifically that they're best able to absorb. So chlorophyll A is going to best absorb in the blue-violet zone. We can see that over here. Chlorophyll B in sort of the red zone, but also over here as well. The carotenoids are sort of in that zone as well. What we haven't shown are some of the less. I couldn't find a graph that showed these. There are some other photosynthetic pigments, as I mentioned, that will absorb in sort of the gaps in between, but they don't do it. They're not in great abundance, so they can help, but it's not sort of where we're seeing most of photosynthesis happening. So the good news is that with the use of the accessory pigments, along with our basic chlorophyll A photosynthetic pigment, we're able to pretty much cover the entire visible spectrum. That's going to allow us to maximize the use of light. And it's important to know that, some of the pigments have other functions as well, aside from just broadening the amount of the potential wavelengths of light that can be absorbed and utilized by the plant. Some of them are going to have some protection features, almost like sunscreen for the leaf, where they're going to protect it from excess light exposure. They're going to absorb it and release it as heat. So that's called photoprotection. So that's a minor point just to add on. But if we're looking at the fundamental function of those accessory pigments, it's simply to help us absorb and utilize as much of the visible spectrum as is possible. So one question I often get at this point in the lesson is, well, what the heck is happening with our leaf colors in the fall? Why do they suddenly change color? And so that's a function of the fact that at certain temperatures, that chlorophyll might begin to break down. So in the fall, for example, chlorophyll is going to start to break down because of our decreasing temperatures. That's a signal to the plant that, the weather's changing and we need to have a different strategy to survive. So, in spring and summer, we're going to see a lot of chlorophyll, high concentrations of chlorophyll in our leaves, but as the weather changes, the amount of chlorophyll is going to decrease. And so it's not as though these other pigments are not there. They're just sort of masked by the overabundance of chlorophyll relative to the other pigments. There's just a lot more chlorophyll that's there in comparison to some of our other pigments that are listed here. So what happens when the chlorophyll starts to break down is that we start to see some of the other pigments unmasked, as it were. So when we look at, and of course we also know that leaves, depending on the type of tree, the leaves will change to different colors. And that might be just because of that particular plant's unique combination of pigments that are naturally present and that they're there in different concentrations, right? So we might see more xanthophyll versus carotenoid versus anthocyanin, but they're each responsible for a different particular color because they are, of course, reflecting a different wavelength within the visible spectrum. So that's it for a conversation around photosynthetic pigments and accessory pigments. I hope that this lesson made sense to you and that you'll reach out if you have any questions or if there are any points of clarification. So stay tuned for our next lessons where we're going to delve into the specifics of the light reactions and the light independent reactions of the process.